Pops in a pod. Pops in a pod.
Hey everyone, Peter Pop here.
And Nadir Pop here.
So, Nadir, in our last episode, we left a teaser towards the end saying that we were going to talk to a winner of the Big Little Book Awards, which is brought by the Parag initiative, which is part of the Tata Trust.
That's right. And she is a veteran in her own right, considering the number of books that she's illustrated, written, and obviously eventually published. We are talking about Deepa Balsavar. She's a writer, illustrator, and educationist who has many, many award winning books to her name. Just to name a few, um, she's written The Seed and The Lonely King and Queen.
And to be honest, when we were reading about her, it's so great that she decided to do this because when she was growing up, she wanted to be a vet, but went to art college instead. And she decided that if she couldn't treat animals, she would write and draw stories about them, the people, and the world. So I guess the animals' loss and humans' gain.
Yeah, and she would have definitely given us a very different perspective if she was a vet. But she's actually told us a lot about her both personal as well as professional life. And to hear that, I think we should jump right in.
Hi, Deepa. Thanks so much for joining us on Pops in a Pod.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Nadir.
Hi Deepa, it's so nice to have you on a lovely, lovely Saturday morning. I must say you look very nice, so thank you so much.
Thank
Although our
you.
listeners can't see you, but yeah, just a validation that you look great in your sari.
So,
Thank you.
For a lot of people wondering what are the pops talking about to an illustrator, well, I must start off by saying congratulations on winning the Big Little Book Award. Quick reactions. How does it feel?
It's amazing. The Big Little Book Award is an award given by the Tata Trusts through their Parag initiative. And it validates the work of children's book illustrators. It sort of recognizes that children's books are important. And usually this award is given during the Tata Lit Fest at the same time that awards are given to writers in mainstream literature. So to be on the same stage and to be recognized is a huge thing. So it's a very important award and a huge validation of the work that we do. I'm chuffed. I mean, frankly, I couldn't believe it when they first rang up and told me.
That's amazing. And also what we've noticed, and because we've grown up during the time where I think having picture books was such a big deal, right? Like when you were kids, then teens and then young adults, there was always this whole significance. At least for me, I've always grown up on a very, very heavy appetite of Tintin and Tinkle and Archies, and then it moved on to other sort of graphic novels. So there was always this fascination, and this is something that at least I can talk about myself, and I think that's how I kind of got into reading. But you've been in this whole field of being an illustrator for over 2 decades, and I'm sure you must have seen a lot of changes, a lot of transformations, and some interesting developments. Could you just tell us a little bit about that what was it when you started and what are things today?
I have to say that, well, I have been illustrating and all that for over 30 years, actually. When I first began, it was over 30 years ago. I, of course, grew up at a time when we had lending libraries in every area. And we would go and sit down there and pick up books and read through them and bring them home. But the books available were mainly written by English authors. So we had the Enid Blytons, we had the Bobbsey twins, we had books that were written by outsiders or non-Indians for a non-Indian audience. Then later on, Amar Chitra Katha came into the picture, and I remember all of us avidly collecting all the Amar Chitra Kathas. But there was still no literature for Indian written by Indians. There were no books written for children who could recognize the characters and say, this looks like me, or this person lives in an area like I live in. So, children's book illustration and children's books have really come into their own in the last 30 years. With the growth of, there was always NBT, which is the National Book Trust, which was started, I think, in the late 50s to bring out books and make them accessible to an Indian audience. Children's Book Trust was also started around the same time to make children's books available. They're two separate trusts. NBT brought out a lot of children's books with some fabulous artists, amazing artists who illustrated for them. But the distribution was never very good. So you never had really access to those books. Then in the last 25 years, I think 25, 30 years, we had the growth of small independent publishers who were dedicated to bring out books for children and who realized that we have to bring out books that talk to our children, talk to our audiences. And so you had Eklavya in Bhopal, you had Tulika in Chennai, and you had a host of others, Jyotsna Prakashan in Bombay and Pune. And suddenly, it was slow at the beginning because it was never considered an important investment. Buying books for children was not considered something on which you spend too much money on, because children are going to grow up, right? I mean, then what do you do with those books? But slowly, as the independent publishers started promoting and bringing out books for Indian children, the audience started growing. And I think that it has been a fantastic opportunity for Indian writers and Indian book illustrators to get into the field. And it's really grown exponentially since then. So there have been changes. So see, picture books and children's books have been around in Western countries, in Europe, in America, and all that for a long time. So the growth of children's books in India has been only in the past few decades. A lot of our children still don't have access to material. Forget about online material. You're talking about online videos and or YouTube and all that for a very small percentage of the population. For most children in our country, even the possession of books is a huge and wonderful, treat. So, is it changing to a point when children's books are going to be not so desirable? I don't think so, because I think we still have to reach out to a lot of children. There have been changes in the access of Indian children's books. There have been a change in the number of publishers who are coming out with Indian children's books. Of course, there has been a change in the number of writers and illustrators who are entering the field, but it's all to the good. I think the industry is not downward. There are, of course, problems with the pandemic and all that. Everybody suffered badly because how do you supply books to bookshops? How do bookshops sell when they're all closed? And things like that. How do you get children together to do storybook readings and everything? But hopefully, once everything opens up again, so will the world of children's books to a lot of children.
Oh, thanks for kind of summarizing that very well for us, because now that you're talking about it, it kind of makes sense, and it's a sequence of events, but it's everything kind of working together. But before we go on, I want to go back to something that you said earlier, and that was the distribution, because you got me nostalgic and thinking about the times I would buy a book or get access to a book. And Nadir and I have talked about this on the podcast before. It's no surprises, but during a train journey or travel, and people who are from Bombay would be familiar with the Wheeler bookstores that are there at the railway stations in Bombay. And those were, I realized, one of the few places that I actually got something like an Amar Chitrakatha that I could read. And you read the thing through the entire trip because that's all you had. There was no mobile phone, nothing else to distract you, right? And I want to draw parallel to that with another thing, which is the distribution was one aspect, and you kind of got lost in that book. But the time when I would lend a book from the library and be reading about, the Hardy Boys or the Famous Five, the world was completely different in there. Like, while I was reading about them in my school didn't have lockers, or we didn't have, things like they had. It was just so strange. Like, for us, it was like a portal into a different kind of world that you had. So, just to kind of build on that, right? Books, in a way, if you think about it, are a portal for kids into a completely different world that they've not explored. But for younger kids, illustrated books play that role, right? I mean, you've got them understanding new concepts, the whole thing about colors. Like, one book my son really loved when he was young was where he could actually feel different kind of textures.
Textures.
And that was so cool. Like, when I think about it, where were those books when we were young, right? We didn't have access to all of that. And Nadir and I sometimes always passes comment saying, our kids are so much lucky. The access, especially in terms of illustration in books that you see currently, we never saw as a child. And do you see that also? Is that something, as somebody working in the field, have you also noticed difference?
Well, for sure. I mean, when I was young, as I was saying, that we had all these books where you read about faraway trees and fairies, and you read about lemon tarts underneath the elm and things like that. It, as a child, you are able to enter those worlds. It's okay. I mean, it's okay if it's something that you don't immediately relate to. You can still enter that world. I mean, we are a generation that grew up on talking mice, Mickey Mouse, and Donald Ducks, and all that, and had no problem with animated characters who acted human. Correct? I mean, it didn't need too large a stretch of the imagination to do all that. But there is a saying among librarians, and that is books are mirrors and windows. So the mirrors are when it shows, reflects back to you a world that you are familiar with and that you can see yourself in. You can place yourself, if not yourself immediately, but a world that you are familiar with. And the windows, of course, open out your eyes to other worlds that you would not see, and other places that you would not have around you. And the wonderful thing about picture books is that it does both for children. And there are so many different windows to places in our own country. For a child who is growing up in Mumbai, knowing what it is to live in the Northeast, or for a child in the city to know what it is to be a tribal child, or for a child who lives on the coast to know what it is to be a child in the mountains. All these are are totally new worlds, and yet they are within our own country. So there is also, I think, a growing understanding that we need to show children these worlds. Gone are the days when you had these. Do you remember those school charts that you had to buy and stick in your journals, which showed ideal family and Adarsh
Yeah.
Balak
Others,
and things
correct.
like that? Yeah, right. And so the families were always a father, mother, and a boy and a girl, and the father sitting with the newspaper in the living room, while the girl helped the mother in the kitchen, and then the father was pottering with something, and the son was helping him make it. And these were pictures of the Adarsh Balak you had. You don't find those. I hopefully those are not as commonly around anymore, because there is an expanding view of the fact that the world is larger, that there is more, that there should be more acceptance. I'm not saying that there always is, but a realization that there should be more acceptance of differences of interests of equality, of the way in which people live, and acceptance of who people are. And so that has meant that there is scope for a whole new range of books that weren't there earlier. Children with differently abled children, children with two fathers uh, as parents, or two mothers as parents. And all these are now slowly being seen in children's books that weren't there earlier.
Deepa, it's very interesting that you actually bring up the whole aspect of diversity and inclusiveness. And this is something that we have also noticed. I mean, now that we are parents, we have so much access to content which I think as just married couples or even single, we would never bother with. Right now I know the Peppa Pig tune at the back of my head, and it's like a trigger, right? Just today in the morning, I woke up with the news that Baby Shark Doo is the first video on YouTube to reach 10 billion views, right? So you can only imagine the potential of, I don't know who's watching it more, the parents or the kids, because it has that very weirdly enticing tune to it. And even Disney is now kind of getting into that zone where you want to show differently able characters who are main protagonists and everything. But as you rightly said, that it stems from somewhere, right? And I think books is where it sort of stems from. And in your opinion, do you feel that children need to focus on the reading aspect, because it's not just them who has to do it, like even the parents have to be encouraged, even the parents have to be kind of pushed because of this new aspect of window and mirror. So how do you encourage not the children but the parents to kind of push their kids into reading these beautiful materials?
So Peter was, when we were talking before the podcast, and Peter said something about his son watching him and then mimicking. So the best way to get children reading is to read yourselves. That is, I would say, the most important and the most fundamental way to get children reading. You sit with your book. It doesn't have to be a child's book all the time, but the children's books are around, and you sit with your book, and the child will pick up on that and start looking at his or her books. So that's one, that children learn by imitation. So to encourage children to read, the parents must read. Secondly, I think it's very, very important to keep aside some quiet time at the end of the day. Take away all the mobile devices, all the electronic devices, and spend some time before going to bed talking about the day, telling a story, reading out from a book, so that it becomes a ritual, a routine, a tradition within the family to read. And I think that once that habit is created, it is a habit that will last the child lifelong. So I know that, there are children who then move away from it because as they grow older, their world expands. They have friends, they have school, they have social media and all sorts of things. But a habit that has been formed at an early age, children will come back to. And so my this would be two things: read yourselves and read to children, and that's the way to get them to be readers.
No, it's interesting that you bring that up because I started reading very late in my life, like books, not picture books, because there was a point where I was so attracted to pictures I couldn't read anything without
Yeah.
images, and I think that's the way even kids are. Like today, when we are reading books to our daughter, and she has like this massive shelf just filled with her types of books, and she only likes to read books which have images and illustrations and pictures. There, she's chimed in already in the background. And the minute you try and graduate her to these novels which have no images or anything, suddenly she'll be like, what is this? It's so difficult to read. Do you feel that there is this mental block that images obviously help them imagine, but it's a support system which they continue to sort of seek? And even today as adults, we love graphic novels, because it just gives you such an interesting imagination where you can check, okay, this is not how I would have imagined it, the way the artist has imagined, right? And I think that has sort of come about. So where do you feel that this transition from picture books to regular books, and how the images help these kids to imagine?
Okay, so I would say don't be in a hurry to transition your child from picture books to chapter books. I still read picture books. I love them. I have a larger collection. Well, I have to tell you that when my daughter was young, now she's of course all grown up and probably your age, but when she was young, I would buy two sets of children's books. One book was for her, and it was her book, so she could write on it, she could go to bed, sleep with it, she would like bend it and all that. And one set was for me, which I kept aside and I preserved because I didn't know whether I would get those books again. So two things I did was, firstly, I made sure that when I was reading out a book to her, I always told her the name of the author and the illustrator, because she should know that these books are created by people. They don't emerge out of nowhere. And it also developed in her a critical ability. So when we went to bookstores, she would ask for a particular author or a illustrator by name. She would say, are there any more picture books by Manjula Padmanabhan? She used to love this picture book called A Visit to the City Market, which was brought out by NBT, and which I think is one of the most fabulous children's books, young children's books ever brought out. And she would say, are there any more books by her? Or is there another book that, is there a Raoul Dahl that I don't have? And she was 4 and 5 years old at that time. So I think firstly, it's very important for children to be acquainted with the names of the people who create the books. Secondly, okay, so this is something that, firstly, it's important to understand that picture books are books which are primarily pictures, where predominantly the picture forms the most important part of the book. There is text, sometimes there's no text at all, in which case they are pure picture books. Other times there is some amount of text, and the text is there, and then the picture supports the text and carries it forward. So the important thing to understand is the illustrations, and the way I look at it, the illustrations in a picture book are not there to embellish the text. The illustrations are there to carry the story forward, to create a world and create other relationships, geographies, histories that the child follows. So you see, whether it's a child or whether it's an adult, you read a picture as much as you read the text, because you read things into what you see. The importance of picture books is not just the imagination, it's also the fact that the child is free to create their own stories. It builds a vocabulary. When a child looks at a picture and says, what is this? And you supply the word, that is building the vocabulary of the child. When the child says that, when you say, oh, look at the clothes they're wearing, do you think, what kind of season is this? And they say, it must be hot. So you say, yes, it's summer. Then they're learning a critical understanding of the relationships between temperature and geography and all that. When you say, who do you think this person is? And the child says, that looks like the grandparent. Then they're learning how to differentiate between relationships and the interaction between different people in the pictures. So the picture book does a whole lot more than just open up the child's imagination. That it does. And children create their own stories just from the pictures, whether you read the text or not. You'll find that very young children very often don't start a picture book at the very beginning. They open it at any page and they want you to start the story then. That's because the idea is that there are stories to be told on every page. There are stories to be made out of every picture. So I cannot underline the importance of picture books enough in helping children notice things, developing a critical understanding, finding relationships between people, building a vocabulary, and of course, letting their imagination soar. So let them read picture books. I still read picture books. I have in this cupboard behind me, I have the entire Tintin and the entire Goscinny and Uderzo, the the Gaul, Asterix.
I
I
was just
have
going
the
to say that
entire
Asterix and
collections.
Obelix.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So and I keep an eagle eye on them. And if anybody borrows them, I make a note
Oh
and I
boy.
make sure
Yeah.
that they bring it back. Don't The chapter books will happen. You see, they're going to, once children go to school, they have to read, they have to learn how to read. So that's going to happen, but they can always still enjoy picture books all throughout, and I hope
Yeah.
the parents do too.
Yeah, and I think that's the lesson that everyone's taking away from this, right? And I love how you said you used to buy two sets of books. So if any parent is listening to this and doing that, hey, you're doing it the right way, right? Because you can always get access in there. Now here's something that Nadir and I keep discussing amongst ourselves, and it'll be great to get your insight on, is you talked about how, initially you also read a lot of books which were not Indian characters, and then slowly you had the National Book Trust that came in. But if you think about it, especially from a storytelling point of view, India is really rich in stories, right? I mean, we've grown up hearing a lot of folklore stories and things like that. But I must say, as a parent, I really struggle to kind of get those same stories to my kids, right? Like Nadir talked about earlier, it's so much easier for my son to get attracted to a Peppa Pig or something else versus trying to tell him Indian stories. And what would you say is a great way to kind of introduce them and just build their curiosity, build that thing like you said with your daughter, right? Go back and saying, which is the Roald Dahl book that I don't have yet. What's something like you would suggest?
So the thing is, I think we're all disadvantaged a little bit in that I presume Peter and Nadir, both of you speak English at home and you speak English with your children, correct? Our rich tradition, our folklore tradition, which has been an oral tradition for generations and generations and centuries, has been a storytelling tradition which has always been a highly animated form of storytelling. The storyteller would come to the village sometimes with pictures and fards or this behind, and the pictures would be shown while the story was recited or sung. It involved a lot of singing, it involved a lot of interaction and things like that. When we retell a lot of stories in English, a lot of that is lost. Now, my language, my mother tongue is Konkani. And when I tell Konkani stories, which I do, I record them sometimes for children, and I record them to send to my nephews and nieces. These stories are full of little rhymes. They're full of little ditties, the kind of they're the Indian Peppa Pigs, I would say, and they're much more interesting and much more entertaining and all that. We have received in English sanitized versions of a lot of those. For instance, the Jataka tales and this. I remember books when I was young, which used to come with these page-long stories, and at the bottom there was always moral of the story is. And it used to really bug me because I used to think, why the hell should it have a moral? Uh, Children are smart enough to understand what the story is telling without you having to thrust it down their throat and say, so see, this is what you should do. What happens is that we need to get back sometimes to our own storytelling traditions and this. Learn some of the stories from your parents or your aunts and uncles and all that. Learn them in your mother tongue. Learn to tell those stories and or create ditties of your own. And I'm sure you will be able to enrich and enliven the bold, bland English stories that we now tell children.
No, you've actually said it right, and this is something my personal experience has been that as when I was growing up, my parents were very and because I went to a school called Christ Church, ICSE school, and obviously English was such a big deal back then, and all the parents, the reason why they send their kids to a Jesuit school is simply so that they can learn good English. And I remember there was a point when I was talking to a friend of mine, and we were just very naturally talking in Hindi, and my mom was listening on the other side, and that time we had landlines with two-way, and then she would listen. It's like, why are you talking in Hindi? Talk in English, and I was like, what the hell? So I grew up like that, but when it comes to like my daughter, she has exposure to three other languages outside of English. So my wife has taken up the onus of talking to her in Hindi/Urdu. I talk to her in Gujarati because I come from a Gujarati speaking family, and our help at home, we insist that they talk to her in Marathi, right?
Marathi,
So
correct.
she needs to get the kind of exposure and understand. And today she's like, the way she speaks, it's just scary because it's a mix of like, I don't know what language, and it's very endearing, but at the same time the syntax is all wrong. But it's okay. I mean, I guess that's the only way that she
It'll
learns.
get
So
sorted out.
exactly, and the reason why I'm narrating this story is because I was not very good with Hindi when I was growing up, and it so happened that my career choices took me to a very Indian mass industry, which is television, and television is Hindi, and people would just mock my Hindi because I had that very strong Gujarati twang, and I just never learned the way it's supposed to be spoken. So it took me a lot of years to unlearn. So I completely get your point when you say that to tell stories in your own language or other languages, because I think the kind of nuances that you can pick up from there are so much more brighter, right, as opposed to when you're translating it into English. So yeah, I completely get
And
that.
there is a Konkani story, and it's called Kail Gupchikani. So Kail Gupchi means the story of the crow and the sparrow. And it's about a crow it's about a sparrow and a crow who live on a tree. And the crow and the sparrow has three fledglings. Is there a word for baby sparrows?
I'm not,
Sparrowlings,
I
sparrowlets.
I would just assume chicks. So
Oh, chicks, yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Let's call them chicks. and, and the crow desperately wants to eat the chicks, these lovely tender chicks that are there in the sparrow's nest. And one night it's raining very heavily, and so he comes to the sparrow's door and says, let me in because it's raining. And she's very reluctant at first, but she finally takes pity on the poor crow, and then she lets him in. And of course, in the middle of the night, he eats the three chicks, and then he disappears early in the morning. And when she wakes up, she finds that the nest is empty. Now, you'll find that a lot of traditional stories are rather cruel, or what we consider cruel in the way we look at how children get traumatized by stories or what will happen and all that. But anyway, this is a traditional story. So she wakes up and she finds that the nest is empty, and she decides that she has to catch the crow. But how does she catch him? So what she does is she flies down and she picks up three round, smooth, white stones, and she brings them back to her house, and she heats them up on the tawa until they are absolutely hot. And then she goes to the edge of her nest, and she calls out, Eltadichakailiano, Peltadichakailiano, Lonia unda konazai, means crows from over here and crows from over there. Who wants a laddu made out of butter? And and all the crows come running, and they say, Makazai, Makazai, Makazai. And and she keeps telling them, no, 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 not for you, not for you, until this fat crow, who's already replete with the chicks, hears, and he can't resist the thought of these butter laddus, and he comes, and she's calling out again, El tadicha kailiano, pel tadicha kailiano, lonia undu konazai. And he comes and he says, Makazai, Makazai. And she says, yes, they're just for you. You ran away before I could give you breakfast. And of course, those hot laddus get lodged in his throat, and he dies. And then the stomach is cut open and the chicks fly out. So it's a very gory story. Children love it, of course, because it is so gory, and because in some way children like the villain to get a comeuppance. The villain has to be shown a lesson, right? And the gorier, the better, I find it. Now, of course, sometimes when I tell these stories, I modify the end a little bit and make it a little bit more palatable for the parents rather than the children, because it is the parents who object more than the children do. But these are the traditional stories. And this is what I mean by saying that, there is a lyricism to these stories that somehow gets lost when we just read out a story from a book, unless the story has got these built-in sounds, has got these built-in rhymes to it, which then you can animate and do. So my own language has a whole host of these stories with these little rhymes in it, and rhymes that add on to each other, and rhymes that elongate, and the story is carried on. In Gujarati, there are some wonderful stories like that. In fact, the Nadir, there's this absolutely phenomenal storyteller and educator called Gijubai Badeka. So Gijubai Badeka wrote a book. There's a book called Diva Swapna, which is on his life. So he was an educator in Gujarat, near Ahmedabad, I think, and he went from village to village collecting folk tales and stories, which he used then to teach children. So in every language, you will find that there are traditional stories that I think should be brought back to life. And certainly as parents, we can do it. The start can be made there.
No, it's very fascinating that you brought up the goriness in these stories. As a as a parent, you would want your children to shy away from it or say, oh no, how can we introduce our children to whatever blood, gore, death, or whatever it is. But then, as you said, even kids stories are replete with these concepts, which are very life concepts. And my daughter also has a certain understanding. Obviously my daughter gets hyper logical, so if she would have read your or heard you say the story, the first thing she'll probably come up with, like, how is there a red hot tawa in a sparrow's nest, right? Like, she'll come up with stuff like that, which is, I don't know how to counter something like that, but she's very hyper logical that way, but which is fine. It's great. But on what the question that I wanted to ask you next is that oral tradition is something very different, but today the kind of access these kids have, right? And we spoke about a little bit about the technology and the screens and whatnot, and the kind of attraction that they get when they watch these 3D images and 2D cartoons or whatever it is. Kids, and I get it, parents have to encourage their children, and it's all set by example. If you do it, the child will probably do it as well. But do you feel that because now there is so much access to digital content, whether it's your OTT platforms or whether you have these digital book apps, right? Your Raz Kids and Epic Books or whatever it is, right? Do you think it's taking away from the traditional mode of storytelling, or is it adding on to the fact that, okay, the storytelling remains the same, but just the medium has changed? What are your views on this new technology that has sort of, we have to live with?
It would just be my personal opinion on this sort of thing. I think that part of the problem is because we have a whole middle class now who talks a lot of English and who's lost connection with our roots. That it's not the fault of the digital media so much as the fact that we have moved away from traditional roots. So that is one. But the digital media has, in a sense, also, on the other hand, helped people reconnect, because now I can tell stories in my language, and people who have lost connection with the stories can re-access them through the digital media. So it works both ways. I think, you see, change in the last, 70 years or so has been so rapid, has been so phenomenally quick, that you can't blame anybody. If something new comes on the market, people want access to it. And I think it's very silly when people hearken back to the good old times, because I think in the good old times, if we had mobile phones and laptops, we'd be using them. It's just that we had no access to them, and so we were forced to do things in other ways. So one can't, in that sense, blame technology for being there. What one can do is say that one has to, I think, look at one's priorities and say, how do we maintain a balance between accessing and using technology, and at the same time retaining things that we felt were of value. And I think that technology can help in bringing back some of the lost forms that people don't have access to anymore. You don't have your grandmother? Here's another grandmother who'll tell you a story. You can't go and see, your village has stopped these performances. Here's another village where the performances still exist and one can have access to them. So has the mode changed? Yes, the mode has changed. But I think also our desire to access them has changed a little bit, and we need to have some sort of balance and try to get back and say, yeah, these things are important. These are the things we want our children to be connected to, and therefore I'll go out of my way to search for them, because they're not in the house anymore. I don't have a grandmother in the house anymore. I don't go every summer vacation to my when I was young, we used to get passes, concessions to go to your home village.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we don't
A
have
lot of
access to those things anymore, right?
yeah. That's such a cool concept. When I discovered it, I was like, what, you actually used to get like an allowance to be able to go
Yeah,
home
yeah,
once a year and things like that. And I
yeah.
think
It
Nadir and my generation have completely kind of missed out
completely out of, yeah, yeah.
because our
So
hometown
it
unfortunately is
is
Bombay,
Bombay.
right?
Exactly. No, well, we were also brought up in Bombay, but you could always put your hometown as somewhere. So for me, my hometown was always Bangalore, because I had my cousins in Bangalore. And so what it meant was you got railway ticket concessions. So the tickets were, anyway, as a child, your tickets were cheaper, but with railway concessions, they were even cheaper because you were visiting your hometown. And so for a pittance, one could go home, and that was registered, of course, in the school, this thing. And so every year you went, you took tickets. And of course, at that time, there was, oh my God, is my age really showing so badly? Because we didn't travel abroad, right, for every vacation, and we didn't travel all over this. For us, vacation was 2 months of doing nothing in the hometown, sitting in the sun, or rather sitting with your head in the shade, with your feet in the sun, with a plate of laddus beside you and a book. And that was it. And I remember spending 2 months that way, doing nothing else. No extra classes, no going for hobby classes or learning new things, no tuitions. Nobody did tuitions when I was young. As I say, that's another. So for those who cannot see me and my gray hair, it's another indicator of the age that I come from. But
Honestly,
but yeah,
listening to you just narrate this entire thing, I think a lot of people would be like, you know what, this is what we want our kids to have as a summer vacation. We don't want them to be glued into their iPads
yeah,
and tuned in on YouTube, on Netflix, or what have you, right? So this sounds like straight out of one of those books that we used to read in there, right? But I'm gonna bring you to something which may put you at a little bit of uneasiness, but I have to.
okay,
You've got a vast body of work that's been published, right? I mean, at this point, we've been talking for close to like more than 40 minutes. And for a lot of our listeners, they may be curious and want to possibly buy some of it. Now, considering the vast body of work that you have, uh, no one's going to be able to go buy all of it. So, what would you recommend, especially for like different age groups, that at least some of our listeners could kind of check out? And we'll definitely drop the links later
okay.
on there.
Okay, so firstly, why can't you go out and buy all the books? Secondly, Okay, if I were to recommend some of the books that I think, I have to say firstly that most of my books are picture books for young children. They're not chapter books. I haven't written any chapter books. I do write for adults as well, but I haven't written for that in between age group. But the very first book that was published by Tulika, my own book, which I wrote and illustrated, was called The Seed. So The Seed is a very simple book, and it sort of it tells you my philosophy about child rearing in a sense, because it's about a little girl who discovers a seed, and she puts it in a broken pot, and she puts some soil into it, and she gives it some water, and she puts it underneath the sun, puts it in gives it sunlight, and it sprouts, the seed sprouts. And when the seedling comes up, she takes it to different members in her family, and they all want to know what it's going to be. So, and she doesn't know, because it's just a seed that she found. She has no idea what it's going to be. And with every question, she wonders, what is it going to be? And then she decides at the end that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it's going to be, because that really is my philosophy about rearing children as well. That, like plants, we need to give our children food and water and love and the companionship of other plants like them, and talk to them and nurture them. What the child grows up to be is irrelevant, as long as the child is happy. So that was the first book that I did with Tulika as a writer illustrator. Uh, I love that book because, in a sense, people find many different things in it. And everybody comes and says, "Oh, but I saw this in it, and oh, I saw that in it." And I say, whatever you see is relevant. No picture book should be so simple that what you see is it. You should be able to go back to it again and again and see different things to it. And then I feel that my book is successful. So that's one. The second book that I would recommend is called The Lonely King and Queen. Is about how families come together, and it's another way in which families get formed. And it's about a couple whom I've called a king and queen, and I'll tell you why later. And how they have fulfilling lives, but they feel something is missing, and they go out in search of what is missing in their lives. And they have to cross streams and climb up mountains, and they're held up at several points on their journey. But in the end, they reach their destination, and it's a house from which they're being called to. So all along the journey, they're following this voice that's calling out to them, and the voice keeps getting louder and louder, but they can never hear what the voice is actually saying until they come to this building. And then the voice is much louder, and they go inside and they see this woman, and they say, "Is a voice calling out to us? Is somebody calling out to us from here? Because we've been following this voice that's calling out to us." And she says, "Yes." And she points to a baby in a crib, and they pick up the baby, and they finally hear the words that the voice has been saying all along. And those words are Papa and Mama. So they bring this child home, and they're not lonely anymore. So according to me, every child in this world has the right to be a prince or a princess. Every child is special. And so if a child is a prince or a princess, by default, that makes their parents a king and a queen. So the king and queen of the story are very ordinary people. They live in an extremely ordinary small Mumbai house, which has it's a one-room kitchen place with a mezzanine and the bed up there and all that. So there's nothing special about the whole thing, except for the fact that the child being a princess. And I remember my daughter, when she was about 5 years old, coming and hugging me and saying, "What if you didn't pick me? What if you hadn't come and taken me? What if I had gone to another family? what would have happened? And there was, this anguish in her little voice, and the fear that maybe I could have gone to another, I wouldn't have known you, you know. And so I wrote this story to tell her that it wasn't us who picked her, but she who picked us. That it's the child who chooses the parent. So she couldn't have gone to anybody else. She was meant for our family. And the Lonely King and Queen, also in that sense, the story really is to normalize the process of adoption or different families, to let children ask questions. So The Lonely King and Queen is another book that I have, a lot of people have written into me and said that it's also eased them in the process of adoption in their own families as a bedtime story, because it helps them talk to children about the topic. And yeah, and I really like that book. And there are a couple of others which I will quickly mention. One is unfortunately no longer in print. It was brought out by Tulika Books, and it's called the Round and Round series. So it's a series of 3 books. Each of them has no beginning and no end, because I found that with very young children, they're wordless picture books. And I found that with very young children, they want to open the book at any page and they want you to start telling the story from there. Also, when children really love a story, they want it to go on and on and on. And they constantly say again, 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 until parents get sick and fed up of repeating the same story again and again. So, the idea behind the Round and Round books was to create these little stories which had no beginning and no end. So, there's no cover, there's no frontispiece, no back page, nothing. They're just 6 pages that are connected with the center spine. So the center spine connects all the pages together, and they can go around. You can start on any page and tell the story, and they go round and round and round. And the final book that I think I would like to mention is Nani's Walk to the Park. So Nani's Walk to the Park is a large format book that was sponsored by the Parag Initiative, Tata Trust Parag Initiative, and printed by Pratham. And the idea behind that was that to get the children to gain a sense of community. So Nani takes her grandson on a walk around her neighborhood, ostensibly while going to the park. But while doing so, she takes him down lanes which are important to her. And she has renamed those names. So the lane of love is where Nani feeds all the stray dogs and cats. And when one comes to think of it, these are the things that are important in life. You need your lane of treasures. You need your lane of love. You need your mischief. You need your friends. You need dreams, and you need magic. And so at the end of the book, there is a poster that opens out, and it's a huge poster which shows Nani's entire route and shows that she could have taken a far more direct walk to the park, which was just across the road. But she has chosen to take this circuitous route because it introduces her grandson to the values that are important to her, and it introduces him to the sense of community. There are hundreds and hundreds of figures and things happening, and many side stories that happen on every page. And when you open the poster, you see lots and lots of interconnected stories that cross over pages diagonally and across the poster and all that. And I know children have spent minutes, literally, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, while parents ask them, where is this and what is this and who do you think this one is and what's happening there. And the ability to create all sorts of other stories is possible because you have this large poster at the end. So those are the books I would say go out and buy, or at least borrow.
No, most definitely, we are going to encourage our listeners to buy, and I think starting with us, we want to set an example,
Good.
and we're going to do it first, and we'll definitely have the link in the show notes. And on that note, Deepa, thank you so much. You've spent a better half of your Saturday morning spending with two dads, and we really appreciate that, and telling all these lovely stories and your experiences. So thank you so much, Deepa, for your time.
Thank
And
you. It's been a pleasure.
Right. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Nadir.
That was the bubbly and vivacious Deepa Balsavar. What a chat, Nadir.
yeah, the fact that she spoke so much just shows that there's so much in her still, that she constantly wants to engage with her audience. And in this case, it's just two dads, but she didn't drop a beat, and she was just so excited to tell everything about her books and her personal life, and it was just amazing. It's such a wonder when you talk to such experienced people.
Yeah. And, at some point, I was wishing I kind of like had a pen and paper when she was telling us about the books that she illustrated that we should really check out. So I think we're going to like leave a list in the show notes and maybe on the website. But that's all for this episode. Nadir, something happened earlier last month, which both of us were quite excited about. You want to tell our listeners about it?
Last month, we had the pleasure of recording professionally in a studio, thanks to the audio company Shaw and the production company Made in India. And it was just truly exciting, where we just felt so, we felt like guests, walking in, as if we are so important. But what an experience, right, Peter?
Honestly, after almost 3 years of recording remotely in our own houses and stuff like that, it was such a pleasure just to be in a studio environment. And for the first time, neither of us were worried about, hey, has this file got recorded? Is it all okay? Now we have to wait for exporting. All of that was kind of taken care of. But the second exciting bit is we managed to get two guests into the studio. So if you followed us on social media, you already know this. But we got Varun Dugirala and Pooja Jori, who are the co-founders of the agency Glitch here in Mumbai. And we had a great chat with them about not only being parents, but also working together.
Peter, I don't think we should be giving away any more than this. Guys, the next week's episode is going to be absolutely fantastic in terms of the quality of the audio as well as the conversation. And we really want you to be there and listen to this particular episode.
So, yeah, as always, do check out our social media platforms. We're on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Also, check out our website, which is popsinapod.in.
So, guys, see you next week and do tune in.
See you then.